The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as Maria Santos pushed her mop bucket down the marble corridor of Meridian Tower, the 47-story headquarters of one of America's largest defense contractors. To the executives hurrying past in their tailored suits, she was invisible, just another late-night cleaning lady making minimum wage. They had no idea that the woman emptying their trash cans was a decorated army sniper who had once held a Taliban commander in her crosshairs from over a mile away. And they certainly didn't know that the industrial mop she wheeled around each night was actually a custom-built Barrett M82 sniper rifle, carefully concealed within a hollowed-out cleaning tool that had taken her 3 months to engineer, preparing, and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Maria had learned to disappear in plain sight long before she started mopping floors. During her 8 years as a special operations sniper, invisibility had kept her alive through 3 tours in Afghanistan. Now 2 years after a roadside bomb had shattered her left leg and ended her military career, that same skill helped her navigate a different kind of battlefield. The corporate world of Meridian Defense Systems was just as treacherous as the mountains of Kandahar, filled with its own hidden threats and unspoken rules. At 32, Maria moved with a slight limp that most people attributed to an old sports injury. She kept her dark hair pulled back in a simple ponytail and wore the same navy blue uniform as the other custodial staff. Her badge, clipped to her chest pocket, bore only her first name and employee number, Maria -4718. No one bothered to read it anyway. To them, she was part of the building's infrastructure, as unremarkable as the security cameras or fire sprinklers. The night shift at Meridian started at 11 p.m. and ended at 7, and Maria preferred these hours because the building was quieter, with only security guards and a skeleton crew of engineers working on classified projects. She'd memorized every corner of the 47th floor, where the company's most sensitive operations were housed. The executive conference room where board meetings decided the fate of billion-dollar weapons contracts. The secure server room that housed intelligence data from military installations worldwide. The corner office belonging to Director James Morrison, whose connections to foreign arms dealers had been flagged by federal investigators. Maria's supervisor, Betty Chun, was a 60-year-old grandmother who had been cleaning office buildings for 3 decades. Betty treated Maria with the same maternal kindness she showed all her employees, never suspecting that the quiet young woman, who always volunteered for the most dangerous assignments, had once been one of the military's deadliest marksmen. During their brief interactions in the supply closet, Betty would share gossip about the executives while Maria nodded politely, filing away every detail that might prove useful later. The other custodial workers knew Maria kept to herself, but they respected her work ethic. Carlos Ruiz, who cleaned the lower floors, had tried to ask her out twice before accepting that she wasn't interested in workplace romance. Sandra Williams, who handled the executive suites, sometimes invited Maria to join the staff for drinks after shift, but Maria always declined with a polite excuse. They assumed she was shy or had family obligations. The truth was that Maria couldn't afford to let anyone get too close to her real identity. The mop itself was a masterpiece of covert engineering. Maria had started with a standard industrial mop, the kind with a telescoping aluminum handle and replaceable cotton heads. Over several months, working in her studio apartment's makeshift workshop, she had carefully hollowed out the handle and modified the internal mechanism. The Barrett's barrel fit perfectly inside the extended handle, while the stock and trigger assembly were concealed within the mop's base unit. The cotton mop head, specially treated with a hardening compound, could be removed in seconds to reveal the rifle's muzzle. When assembled, the weapon maintained the same accuracy that had made Maria one of the Army's top-rated snipers. Maria's military service had begun 8 Years earlier, when she enlisted straight out of high school in El Paso, Texas, her father, a Vietnam veteran who worked construction, had taught her to shoot on weekend trips to the desert. Her natural talent caught the attention of her drill instructors, leading to sniper school at Fort Benning. By age 25, she held the record for the longest confirmed kill in her unit, 1,847 meters, during a mission to eliminate a Taliban bomb maker who had been targeting American convoys. The injury that ended her career happened during her final deployment. Maria had been providing overwatch for a patrol in Helmand Province when an improvised explosive device detonated beneath their vehicle. Shrapnel from the blast shattered her left fibula and damaged the nerves in her leg. After 2 surgeries and 6 months of physical therapy, she could walk normally but would never pass the physical requirements for active duty. The Army offered her a desk job at the Pentagon, but Maria couldn't imagine herself pushing papers after years of precision shooting in combat zones. Civilian life proved harder to navigate than any battlefield. The transition counselors had prepared her for employment challenges, but not for the crushing anonymity of minimum wage work. Maria's military skills, situational awareness, weapons expertise, tactical planning had no obvious application in the civilian job market. Her disability rating provided a modest pension, but it wasn't enough to live on. The custodial position at Meridian was supposed to be temporary, just until she could figure out her next move. That was before she discovered what Meridian Defense Systems was really doing. The first hint came during her second week on the job. While emptying trash in Director Morrison's office, Maria noticed a partially shredded document in his personal wastebasket. Years of intelligence training had taught her to notice details that others missed. The fragment contained coordinates for a military base in Eastern Europe and references to weapons shipments that didn't match any authorized contracts she knew about. Maria photographed the document with her phone and spent the next several days researching the coordinates online. The base in question was supposedly decommissioned, abandoned after the Cold War ended. But satellite imagery showed recent activity, vehicle tracks, temporary structures, signs of ongoing operations. Maria cross-referenced the base's location with news reports of regional conflicts and found a pattern. Every time violence escalated in that area, Meridian's stock price jumped. The company was profiting from instability, possibly even encouraging it by supplying weapons to multiple sides of the same conflict. Over the following weeks, Maria began systematically documenting evidence of Meridian's illegal activities. Her position as a night janitor gave her access to offices and conference rooms when they were empty. She photographed shipping manifests that didn't match customs declarations. She recorded conversations using a tiny digital recorder hidden in her uniform pocket. She copied files from computers left unlocked by careless executives who assumed the cleaning lady couldn't read or wouldn't care about their business. The evidence painted a picture of systematic corruption extending from Meridian's board of directors to officials in the Pentagon and State Department. The company was selling advanced weapon systems to unauthorized buyers, falsifying end-user certificates, and using shell companies to disguise the true destinations of their shipments. Some of those weapons were ending up in the hands of terrorist organizations and drug cartels. American soldiers were being killed by bullets manufactured in American factories and sold through Meridian's black market networks. Maria's military training included extensive instruction on the laws of war and rules of engagement. She knew that what Meridian was doing constituted treason, but she also knew that proving it would require more than photographs and recordings. The people involved had too much money and too many connections to be brought down by conventional law enforcement. Whistleblower protections were theoretical. In practice, people who exposed this level of corruption tended to have accidents or simply disappear. That's when Maria decided to take matters into her own hands. Building the concealed rifle required skills she had learned in special operations. where soldiers were trained to improvise weapons and equipment from civilian materials. The project took 3 months of careful work, with Maria purchasing components separately from different suppliers to avoid creating a paper trail. The mop handle came from a janitorial supply company in Arizona. The trigger mechanism was built from parts ordered online. The scope was a civilian hunting model that she modified for military specifications. Testing the weapon required careful planning. Maria drove to a private shooting range 2 hours outside the city, where she could fire the rifle without attracting attention. The first test shots confirmed that the concealment hadn't compromised the weapon's accuracy. At 500 meters, she could still place 5 rounds within a 2-inch circle. The modified mop was as deadly as any rifle she had used in Afghanistan. The plan Maria developed was methodical and precise. She identified 5 key figures in Meridian's conspiracy. Director Morrison, who orchestrated the illegal sales. Chief Financial Officer David Park, who managed the money laundering. General Patricia Hayes, a retired Army officer who provided Pentagon intelligence. Senator Robert Chun, who blocked congressional investigations. And Viktor Kozlov, a Russian arms dealer who facilitated Eastern European sales. Each target had predictable patterns, regular meetings, established routines, security vulnerabilities that Maria could exploit. Maria knew she couldn't eliminate all 5 targets without triggering a massive manhunt. But she didn't need to kill them all. She just needed to send a message that would force them to abandon their illegal activities or expose themselves to law enforcement. Fear was often more effective than bullets, especially when dealing with people who valued their comfortable lives more than their criminal profits. The weapon wasn't just about killing, it was about justice. For 8 years, Maria had served her country with honor, following orders and trusting the system to protect American interests. Now she had discovered that the same system was being corrupted by people who put profit above patriotism. The soldiers dying overseas weren't just casualties of war. They were victims of corporate greed and government corruption. Someone had to hold these people accountable, and Maria had the skills to do it. As she pushed her mop bucket down the empty corridor that Tuesday night in November, Maria Santos looked like just another invisible employee earning an honest wage. The executives, sleeping in their suburban mansions, had no idea that the woman who cleaned their offices was preparing to become their judge and executioner. Tomorrow would bring the first test of her plan, and Maria was ready to prove that some lessons could only be taught at the end of a rifle barrel. Maria's apartment was a Spartan, 1-bedroom unit in a converted warehouse district, the kind of place where nobody asked questions about tenants who worked odd hours or received unmarked packages. The rent was cheap enough to manage on a janitor's salary, and the thick concrete walls provided natural soundproofing for the workshop she had constructed in what was supposed to be a dining room. Industrial shelving lined the walls, holding tools and equipment that would have puzzled most civilians, but were standard issue for special operations soldiers who needed to maintain and modify their weapons in the field. The knowledge Maria possessed wasn't taught in civilian shooting courses or hunting magazines. It was the accumulated wisdom of military snipers who had perfected their craft through decades of combat experience, passed down from instructor to student in classified training programs that most people would never know existed. She understood ballistics calculations that factored in variables like altitude, humidity, and even the Coriolis effect caused by Earth's rotation. She could estimate wind speed by observing grass movement or dust patterns, and calculate bullet drop over distances that would challenge most civilian marksmen. More importantly, Maria had been trained in what the military called target interdiction, the systematic elimination of high-value targets to disrupt enemy operations. The curriculum covered everything from surveillance and reconnaissance to escape and evasion, skills that were considered obsolete in an age of drone warfare and satellite-guided missiles. Modern military doctrine emphasized technology over human skill, precision-guided munitions over trained marksmen. The Pentagon had decided that spending millions on smart bombs was more efficient than investing in soldiers who could think for themselves. But Maria's instructors at Fort Benning had been old-school warriors who remembered when wars were won by individual soldiers making split-second decisions under impossible pressure. Master Sergeant Thomas Rodriguez had served 3 tours in Vietnam before becoming a sniper instructor, and he taught his students that technology was only as reliable as the people operating it. Your rifle will fire when the satellites are down, he used to say during training exercises. Your scope will work when the computers crash. Your brain will function when everything else fails. Rodriguez had been part of a generation of military instructors who understood that modern warfare hadn't eliminated the need for traditional skills. It had simply made those skills less common and therefore more valuable. He taught his students to read terrain like a book, to move through hostile territory without leaving traces, to eliminate targets without alerting enemy forces to their presence. These were capabilities that couldn't be replicated by machines or compensated for by superior firepower. The old methods weren't just about shooting. Rodriguez had trained his students in psychological warfare, teaching them how to identify enemy leadership patterns and exploit organizational weaknesses. He showed them how a single well-placed shot could cripple an entire command structure, how the assassination of one key figure could prevent the deaths of hundreds of soldiers. This wasn't murder, it was surgical intervention, the military equivalent of removing a cancerous tumor before it could spread. Maria had been Rodriguez's best student, absorbing not just the technical aspects of long-range shooting, but the strategic thinking that separated true snipers from mere marksmen. She learned to study her targets for weeks before taking action, mapping their routines and identifying their vulnerabilities. She understood that patience was more important than accuracy, that the right shot taken at the wrong moment was worthless. Most importantly, she learned that successful snipers were invisible not because they hid in camouflage, but because they thought like their enemies and anticipated their reactions. The techniques Rodriguez taught had been developed during World War II and refined through conflicts in Korea, Vietnam, and the Middle East. They represented decades of trial and error, lessons learned through the deaths of soldiers who had trusted inadequate training or unreliable equipment. But by the time Maria graduated from sniper school, these methods were already being phased out in favor of newer approaches that emphasized team operations and technological solutions. The military's transition to digital warfare had created a dangerous knowledge gap. Younger soldiers were trained to operate sophisticated equipment, but not to function when that equipment failed. They could coordinate complex operations using satellite communications, but couldn't read hand signals or navigate without GPS. Trusted their weapons' electronic systems so completely that they never learned to estimate range, using basic geometry or adjust for environmental conditions using their own observations. Maria had witnessed this dependency during her deployments. In Afghanistan, soldiers who performed flawlessly during training exercises became helpless when enemy jamming disrupted their communications or when mechanical failures disabled their high-tech equipment. She had seen patrol leaders panic when their GPS units malfunctioned, even though they were carrying paper maps and compasses as backup. The military was producing technically proficient soldiers who lacked the fundamental skills needed to adapt and improvise under pressure. The irony was that the enemies they faced in Afghanistan and Iraq were using the old methods by necessity. Taliban and insurgent snipers couldn't rely on satellite communications or precision-guided weapons, so they had mastered the traditional techniques that American forces were abandoning. They moved through mountainous terrain using skills their grandfathers had learned fighting the Soviets. They communicated using codes and signals that didn't depend on electronic networks. They planned operations using intelligence gathered through human observation rather than digital surveillance. Rodriguez had warned his students that this would happen. During Maria's final training exercise, he had pulled her aside and explained that the military was making a critical mistake by abandoning proven methods in favor of untested technology. Someday, he had told her, you'll face a situation where none of your fancy equipment works, and you'll need to remember everything I taught you about doing this job the hard way. At the time, Maria had assumed he was talking about combat situations. She never imagined that the lesson would apply to civilian life. The skills Maria had learned weren't just about warfare. They were about understanding human behavior and exploiting systemic weaknesses. Military snipers were taught to think like intelligence analysts, studying their targets' personalities and predicting their responses to different stimuli. They learned to identify the key individuals whose elimination would cause maximum disruption to enemy operations. Most importantly, they were trained to operate independently, making tactical decisions without guidance from higher command. These capabilities had obvious applications beyond the battlefield, but the military classified them so heavily that most veterans never realized they possessed knowledge that could be valuable in civilian contexts. The government didn't want former soldiers to understand how easily their training could be adapted for non-military purposes. There were too many veterans struggling with unemployment and disability, too many reasons why someone might decide to use their specialized skills for personal rather than patriotic purposes. Maria's workshop contained equipment that would have been impossible for a civilian to acquire through legal channels. The rifle components had been purchased separately from different suppliers, but the tools needed to modify them were military-grade precision instruments that she had inherited from her unit's armory when her service ended. Technically, removing government property was theft, but the Army's inventory systems were so chaotic that missing tools rarely triggered investigations. The modifications Maria made to her concealed weapon system went beyond simple camouflage. She had redesigned the trigger mechanism to compensate for the awkward grip required when the rifle was disguised as a mop. The scope had been recalibrated to account for the different shooting positions she would need to use in confined spaces. Even the ammunition was specially prepared hollow-point bullets that would cause maximum tissue damage while minimizing the risk of over-penetration in urban environments. Every aspect of the weapon's design reflected knowledge that the military no longer considered important. Modern sniper rifles were built for long-range precision under ideal conditions, with teams of spotters and support personnel to assist with target identification and environmental calculations. Maria's concealed weapon was designed for close range elimination in unpredictable circumstances, where she would need to act alone without backup or escape routes. The psychological preparation was just as important as the physical modifications. Rodriguez had taught his students that successful snipers needed to compartmentalize their emotions, separating their personal feelings from their tactical objectives. Killing wasn't personal, it was a technical problem that required appropriate solutions. The target wasn't a human being with a family and dreams. It was a strategic asset that needed to be neutralized for the greater good. Maria had applied these techniques during her combat deployments, eliminating Taliban commanders and bomb makers without experiencing the emotional trauma that affected other soldiers. She understood that her targets were responsible for the deaths of American servicemen and Afghan civilians, that removing them from the battlefield would save innocent lives. The moral equation was clear: their deaths would prevent greater suffering. Now, she faced a similar situation in civilian life. The executives at Meridian Defense Systems were just as responsible for American casualties as any Taliban commander. Their illegal weapons sales were directly contributing to the violence that was killing soldiers overseas. The only difference was that they wore business suits instead of military uniforms and killed for profit rather than ideology. They deserved the same fate as any enemy combatant, but operating in civilian environments required different techniques than those used in military combat zones. Maria couldn't rely on air support or extraction teams if her mission went wrong. She couldn't count on military justice to protect her if she was captured or identified. The rules of engagement were undefined, and the consequences of failure would be far more severe than anything she had faced in Afghanistan. The old knowledge Rodriguez had taught her was about to face its ultimate test in a context he had never imagined. Maria Santos was preparing to wage a one-woman war against enemies who didn't even know they were targets. The corporate culture at Meridian Defense Systems exemplified everything wrong with modern American business priorities. The 47th floor buzzed with an energy that had nothing to do with patriotism or national security, despite the company's billion-dollar contracts with the Pentagon. Instead, the atmosphere crackled with the ruthless ambition of executives who viewed warfare as nothing more than a profitable commodity to be bought and sold to the highest bidder. Director James Morrison's corner office served as the unofficial headquarters for operations that would have horrified the soldiers whose lives depended on Meridian's products. The walls displayed framed photographs of Morrison shaking hands with generals and defense secretaries, carefully arranged to suggest a level of patriotic service that couldn't have been further from reality. His mahogany desk, imported from Italy at a cost that exceeded most Americans' annual salaries, held documents that detailed weapons shipments to countries under international arms embargoes. Morrison himself was a Harvard MBA who had never served a day in uniform, but spoke about military strategy with the confidence of someone who believed his business education qualified him to make life-and-death decisions for soldiers he would never meet. At 53, he maintained the lean physique of someone who paid personal trainers more than most families earned in a year, and his custom-tailored suits conveyed an authority that was entirely unearned. He treated military contracts like any other business opportunity, measuring success in quarterly profit margins rather than strategic objectives or soldier safety. The morning briefings in Meridian's executive conference room revealed the casual callousness with which these decisions were made. Chief Financial Officer David Park would present spreadsheets showing projected revenues from weapons sales to various conflict zones, discussing human suffering with the same detached professionalism that other executives might use to analyze smartphone sales. Park was a former Goldman Sachs analyst who had joined Meridian specifically because defense contractors offered higher profit margins than traditional Wall Street investments. The situation in Eastern Europe continues to provide excellent opportunities, Park would announce during these meetings, referring to a regional conflict that had already claimed thousands of civilian lives. Our contacts in the provisional government are requesting additional shipments of small arms and ammunition. The payment terms are extremely favorable, and the end-user certificates have been properly sanitized. He never mentioned that those weapons would be used to massacre refugees, or that the provisional government was a puppet regime installed by foreign intelligence services. General Patricia Hayes brought a veneer of military credibility to these discussions, though her actual service record consisted primarily of Pentagon staff positions where she had never made a tactical decision or faced enemy fire. Hayes had retired from the Army at the earliest possible opportunity and immediately joined Meridian's board of directors, where her former colleagues' trust gave her access to classified information about military operations and procurement. Priorities. She viewed her insider knowledge as a valuable asset to be monetized rather than a sacred trust to be protected. The Joint Chiefs are concerned about readiness levels in the Pacific Theater. Hayes might report during a typical briefing, sharing intelligence that was supposed to remain within official channels. They're likely to approve emergency procurement of anti-ship missiles within the next quarter. If we position ourselves correctly, we could capture the entire contract. She saw no contradiction between her oath as a military officer and her current role in exploiting the very forces she had once served. Senator Robert Chun provided the political protection that allowed Meridian's operations to continue without government interference. Shun chaired the Senate Armed Services Committee and had received substantial campaign contributions from defense contractors for over a decade. His public statements about military readiness and national security bore no resemblance to his private conversations with Meridian executives, where he discussed ways to manipulate procurement regulations and avoid congressional oversight. The Inspector General's office is asking questions about the Syrian contracts. Shun might warn during one of his regular calls to Morrison. I can delay their investigation for another few months, but you need to clean up the documentation. Make sure everything looks legitimate on paper. Shun's definition of national security appeared to prioritize corporate profits over actual defense capabilities. The most dangerous figure in this network was Viktor Kozlov, a Russian arms dealer, who served as Meridian's primary contact for Eastern European operations. Kozlov had connections to organized crime syndicates and intelligence services that allowed him to facilitate weapons transfers that circumvented international law. He operated through a network of shell companies and corrupt officials, creating plausible deniability for Meridian's executives while ensuring that their weapons reached buyers who should never have been able to acquire American military technology. Kozlov's monthly visits to Meridian's headquarters were carefully scheduled, during evening hours when fewer employees would witness his presence. Maria had observed these meetings while cleaning nearby offices, noting how Morrison and his colleagues transformed from confident executives into nervous supplicants whenever the Russian appeared. Kozlov clearly held some form of leverage over them, probably evidence of their illegal activities that could destroy their careers and freedom if it ever became public. The technology that enabled these criminal operations was exactly the kind of sophisticated digital infrastructure that the military had embraced so enthusiastically. Meridian's executives coordinated their illegal activities using encrypted communications, offshore banking networks, and computerized inventory systems that could hide weapon shipments among legitimate cargo. They trusted their electronic security so completely that they never bothered to develop backup procedures for situations where technology might fail them. The company's computer network was protected by firewalls and intrusion detection systems that could repel most cyber attacks, but these defenses were designed to stop external threats. They couldn't protect against someone with physical access to the building, especially someone whose job required her to be alone in executive offices during overnight hours. Maria's military training had included instruction in electronic surveillance and computer security, skills that proved invaluable for documenting evidence of Meridian's criminal activities. More importantly, the executives' reliance on digital communications created vulnerabilities that old-fashioned surveillance methods could exploit. They sent incriminating emails because they believed encryption made them secure. They stored sensitive documents on computer servers because they trusted cybersecurity more than human discretion. They scheduled illegal meetings using electronic calendars because they had forgotten that paper records could be more secure than digital ones. The generational gap between Maria's military training and Meridian's corporate culture created a crucial asymmetry. The executives had grown up in a world where technology solved every problem and digital solutions were automatically superior to analog alternatives. They couldn't imagine threats that didn't involve computer hackers or electronic surveillance. The possibility that a middle-aged janitor might be systematically gathering intelligence using methods developed during World War II was literally unthinkable to them. This technological dependency extended beyond communications and record-keeping to their personal security arrangements. Morrison's bodyguard carried an electronic scanner that could detect concealed weapons, but the device was calibrated to identify conventional firearms and metal objects. It couldn't recognize a weapon that had been disguised as cleaning equipment or hidden within everyday tools. The security cameras throughout the building recorded everything, but they were monitored by guards who had been trained to watch for suspicious behavior rather than methodical intelligence gathering. The executives Daily routines reflected the same misplaced confidence in technological solutions. They used electronic key cards to access secure areas, trusting that digital records would track who entered which rooms at what times. They never considered that a janitor with legitimate access could observe their activities without leaving any electronic trail. They scheduled confidential meetings in rooms that they believed were secure, never realizing that someone with the right training could gather intelligence from adjacent spaces. Even their personal habits revealed how completely they had abandoned the paranoia that had once characterized intelligence work. Morrison left classified documents on his desk overnight because he trusted the building's security system to prevent unauthorized access. Park stored passwords for offshore accounts on his computer because he believed encryption made them safe. Hayes discussed classified military operations on her cell phone because she assumed the conversations were protected by government-grade security protocols. The contrast with Maria's approach couldn't have been more stark. Her military training had emphasized the importance of assuming that any technological system could be compromised and that electronic security was only as reliable as the people operating it. She had learned to gather intelligence using methods that left no digital footprint and to plan operations that didn't depend on technology that could be monitored or traced. The executives at Meridian had forgotten the fundamental truth that military professionals understood: the most sophisticated security system was worthless if the enemy could think of attack methods that the defenders hadn't anticipated. They had become so dependent on electronic solutions that they couldn't recognize threats that used older, simpler approaches. Their overconfidence in modern technology had made them vulnerable to precisely the kind of analog warfare that Maria had been trained to conduct. As she pushed her mop through their offices each night, Maria was gathering intelligence that would have been impossible to obtain through conventional means. She was learning their routines, documenting their communications, and identifying their vulnerabilities using techniques that predated the digital age. The executives sleeping peacefully in their suburban homes had no idea that their fate was being decided by someone who understood that the oldest methods were often the most effective ones. The first signs of trouble appeared in Maria's intelligence files 3 weeks before everything unraveled. Late one Thursday evening, while emptying wastebaskets in the executive wing, she discovered fragments of a shipping manifest that made her blood run cold. The document referenced Project Blackwater, a classified operation she recognized from her time in Afghanistan. According to her military briefings, Blackwater had been a joint CIA-Pentagon initiative to supply weapons to Afghan resistance fighters opposing Taliban forces. The program had officially ended 2 years ago when she was still deployed, yet here was evidence that Meridian was continuing to ship weapons under the Blackwater designation, routing them through the same network of intermediaries that had been used during active operations. The difference was that these shipments weren't going to American allies fighting the Taliban. The destination codes indicated deliveries to militia groups in Syria, paramilitary organizations in Ukraine, and rebel factions in several African nations where the United States had no official presence. Maria photographed the document fragments and spent the weekend researching the implications. Cross-referencing news reports with the shipping dates revealed a disturbing pattern. Every location that received Blackwater weapons experienced a significant escalation in violence within days of delivery. Villages were burned, civilians were massacred, and government forces were overwhelmed by insurgents equipped with American military hardware. The weapons Meridian was selling weren't just fueling conflicts. They were determining their outcomes. The scope of the operation became clear when Maria discovered Morrison's private calendar during her next shift. Hidden among routine business meetings were coded appointments that corresponded with major arms shipments. Lunch with KV appeared on the same day that a cargo plane departed for Eastern Europe carrying surface-to-air missiles. Golf with DP coincided with a shipment of assault rifles bound for West Africa. The executives weren't just profiting from warfare, they were orchestrating it. Senator Chun's involvement ran deeper than Maria had initially suspected. Phone records she accessed from Morrison's computer showed weekly calls between Chun, foreign officials in countries that were supposedly under arms embargoes. The conversations were brief and used coded language, but the timing was unmistakable. Chun would call his contacts. Then Meridian would receive exemptions from export restrictions that allowed them to ship weapons to prohibited destinations. Senator's staff provided administrative cover for these operations through carefully worded legislative amendments that created loopholes in arms control regulations. A single sentence buried in a defense appropriations bill might exempt humanitarian contractors from certain reporting requirements. Another amendment could redefine weapons categories to exclude specific items from export controls. Chun was systematically dismantling the legal framework that was supposed to prevent American weapons from reaching unauthorized users. General Hayes provided the operational intelligence that made these shipments possible. Her contacts in the Pentagon gave her advance warning of military operations, allowing Meridian to position weapons deliveries for maximum impact. When American forces planned to withdraw from a region, Hayes would tip off Morrison so that weapons could be pre-positioned for whatever groups moved into the power vacuum. When NATO allies requested emergency military aid, Hayes would ensure that Meridian's products were included in the packages. The General's intelligence network extended beyond official channels to include relationships with foreign military officers, who provided targeting information for Meridian's customers. A Syrian general might share the locations of government ammunition depots so that rebel forces could plan coordinated attacks. A Ukrainian colonel might reveal the movement schedules of government convoys so that separatist militias could prepare ambushes. Hayes was essentially running a military intelligence operation for the benefit of arms dealers. Viktor Kozlov's role as the operational coordinator was becoming increasingly dangerous for everyone involved. Maria's surveillance revealed that the Russian was growing impatient with the Americans' cautious approach to expanding their operations. During his most recent visit, she had overheard him demanding access to more sophisticated weapons systems, including anti-aircraft missiles and electronic warfare equipment that could neutralize American military technology. "Your government's soldiers are dying because they cannot adapt," Kozlov had told Morrison during a heated conversation in the executive conference room. "They rely too much on their computers and satellites. When those systems fail, they become helpless children. We can sell them the means to defend themselves, but only if you are willing to provide the proper equipment." Morrison's response revealed the extent to which greed had overcome any remaining patriotic instincts. "The Pentagon is already suspicious about our Eastern European contracts," he had replied. "If we start selling counter-electronic warfare systems, they'll know something is wrong." But his tone suggested that he was negotiating rather than refusing, looking for ways to minimize risk while maximizing profit. The conversation had continued with Kozlov explaining how American forces could be deliberately weakened to create larger markets for Meridian's products. If their soldiers cannot communicate or navigate, they will need more equipment to compensate, he had argued. Simple weapons become insufficient when facing opponents with superior coordination. Your military will be forced to purchase whatever we are willing to sell them. Maria realized that she was witnessing the planning of operations that would directly target American soldiers. Kozlov wasn't just facilitating arms sales, he was developing strategies to neutralize American military advantages and create situations where those forces would be vulnerable to attack. The weapons Meridian sold to insurgent groups would be specifically chosen to exploit weaknesses in American tactics and equipment. The psychological pressure of maintaining her cover while documenting these conversations was becoming overwhelming. Every night, Maria had to smile politely at executives who were planning the deaths of soldiers she had served alongside. She had to empty the trash cans of people who viewed American casualties as acceptable collateral damage in their pursuit of profit. The contrast between their comfortable offices and the combat zones where their decisions played out was almost unbearable. The breaking point came when Maria discovered documents related to her former unit in Afghanistan. Meridian had sold portable anti-aircraft missiles to Taliban-affiliated groups in the same province where her old squadron was conducting operations. The weapons were specifically chosen to counter the helicopters that provided medical evacuation and close air support for ground troops. Morrison and his colleagues were deliberately targeting the lifelines that kept American soldiers alive. The intelligence reports that Hayes provided to facilitate these sales included detailed information about American flight patterns, communication frequencies, and tactical procedures. She had essentially given the enemy a handbook for killing American pilots and destroying American aircraft. The helicopters that Maria had depended on for extraction during her own missions were now flying into ambushes, planned with information provided by a retired American general. Maria's surveillance revealed that the next major operation was scheduled for the following month. Kozlov had requested a large shipment of improvised explosive device components, specifically designed to penetrate the armor of vehicles used by American patrol units. The weapons would be delivered to insurgent groups in 3 different countries, timed to coincide with planned American military operations that Hayes had learned about through her Pentagon contacts. The psychological warfare aspect of the plan was particularly insidious. The attacks were designed to create the impression that insurgent groups had developed new capabilities independently, forcing American commanders to request additional equipment and support. Meridian would then bid on the contracts to provide whatever solutions the military thought it needed, profiting from both sides of the conflict they had helped create. The timeline for the operation revealed how completely the conspirators had compromised American military planning. They knew about troop movements, equipment deployments, and operational schedules weeks before the missions were scheduled to begin. American soldiers were walking into traps that had been planned in the comfort of corporate boardrooms, their deaths calculated as acceptable losses in pursuit of increased market share. Maria understood that conventional law enforcement could never stop an operation of this scope and sophistication. The conspirators had too many contacts in government agencies, too much influence over regulatory processes, and too many resources to deploy against potential whistleblowers. Even if she could gather enough evidence to convince prosecutors to file charges, the legal process would take years while American soldiers continued to die from weapons sold by their own country's defense contractors. The situation demanded immediate action using methods that wouldn't depend on institutional support or legal procedures. Maria's military training had prepared her for exactly this type of scenario situations, where the normal chain of command had been compromised and individual initiative was the only way to protect American lives. The executives at Meridian had declared war on their own country's military forces, and they deserved to be treated as enemy combatants. The knowledge that Master Sergeant Rodriguez had taught her was about to prove its value in a context that none of her instructors had ever imagined. The old methods of individual action and precision targeting were the only tools capable of stopping an enemy that had infiltrated every level of the system designed to prevent exactly these kinds of betrayals. The crisis began to accelerate on a rainy Tuesday morning in November when Maria intercepted an encrypted email that made her hands shake as she read its contents. Morrison had received confirmation from his Pentagon contact that Operation Desert Shield 2 would commence in exactly 72 hours, involving a massive deployment of American forces to a strategically critical region where Meridian had been secretly arming insurgent groups for the past 6 months. The timing wasn't coincidental, it was orchestrated. The email, sent from an account registered to a Department of Defense contractor, contained detailed information about troop movements, supply routes, and communication protocols that should have been classified at the highest levels. Someone with access to operational planning had provided Meridian with a complete blueprint for American military activities, including the exact locations where convoys would be vulnerable to ambush and the frequencies that jamming equipment would need to target to disrupt communications. Maria realized that she was looking at evidence of the largest betrayal of American forces since Benedict Arnold. The operation wasn't just about selling weapons to insurgents. It was about engineering a military disaster that would justify massive increases in defense spending while eliminating American soldiers who might eventually uncover the conspiracy. The executives at Meridian weren't just war profiteers. They were actively collaborating with enemy forces to kill their own countrymen. The scope of the intelligence breach became clear as Maria continued reading the intercepted communications. Hayes had provided detailed information about the psychological profiles of American commanders, identifying officers who were likely to request additional air support or change tactical plans under pressure. Kozlov's associates had used this information to position anti-aircraft weapons in locations where they would be most effective against rescue helicopters and close air support aircraft. The insurgent groups receiving Meridian's weapons had been given specific instructions about targeting priorities. Rather than attacking American positions randomly, they were directed to focus on communications equipment, medical evacuation helicopters, and supply convoys carrying ammunition and food. The goal was to isolate American forces and force them to rely on emergency resupply missions that could be targeted with weapons. Meridian had specifically provided for that purpose. The psychological impact of the planned attacks had been carefully calculated by experts who understood how American military units responded to casualties and equipment losses. The insurgents were instructed to focus on causing dramatic rather than necessarily fatal injuries, creating medical emergencies that would strain evacuation resources and force commanders to divert personnel from combat operations to casualty care. Every aspect of the plan was designed to maximize American vulnerability while creating justification for increased military spending. Maria discovered that the operation extended beyond simple arms sales to include sophisticated electronic warfare capabilities that could neutralize American technological advantages. Kozlov's network had acquired jamming equipment capable of disrupting satellite communications, GPS navigation, and drone control systems. American forces would find themselves fighting blind, unable to coordinate with higher command or rely on the technological superiority that had defined modern warfare. The timing of the attacks was synchronized with a carefully orchestrated media campaign designed to shape public perception of the crisis. Chun's staff had prepared press releases blaming the American casualties on inadequate equipment and insufficient funding for military operations. The senator would appear on television calling for urgency defense appropriations, while Meridian's lobbyists worked behind the scenes to ensure that their products received priority consideration for new contracts. The most disturbing aspect of the plan was its use of American casualties as a marketing tool for Meridian's products. Each soldier killed or wounded by weapons the company had sold would become justification for purchasing newer, more expensive equipment. The families of dead Americans would unknowingly become props in a sales presentation designed to generate billions in government contracts. Their grief would be monetized as efficiently as any other business opportunity. Maria's analysis of the intelligence reports revealed that the conspirators had anticipated potential resistance from military officers who might question the sudden escalation in insurgent capabilities. Hayes had compiled lists of commanders who were likely to investigate the source of enemy weapons or request changes in operational procedures. These officers would be assigned to the most dangerous positions, where they could be eliminated by enemy action before they became problematic. The operation included provisions for eliminating American personnel who posed threats to the conspiracy's security. Military intelligence officers, weapon inspectors, and logistics specialists who might notice irregularities in supply chains had been identified for targeting. Their deaths would be attributed to combat casualties, but they would actually be murdered to protect a criminal enterprise that extended to the highest levels of government. The psychological pressure of possessing this information while maintaining her cover as a harmless janitor was pushing Maria to her breaking point. Every conversation she overheard contained details about planned attacks on American soldiers. Every document she photographed revealed new aspects of a betrayal so comprehensive that it challenged her ability to comprehend its scope. She was surrounded by people who discussed American casualties with the same casual indifference they might show for quarterly profit projections. The realization that conventional law enforcement was completely inadequate to address this crisis forced Maria to confront the implications of her situation. Federal agencies had been infiltrated by the same network of corruption that protected Meridian's operations. Congressional oversight committees were controlled by senators like Chen, who actively facilitated arms trafficking. Even military justice systems could be compromised by officers like Hayes, who provided insider information to enemy forces. The timeline for the planned operation left no time for bureaucratic solutions, even if trustworthy officials could be identified. American soldiers would begin dying in 72 hours, unless someone took immediate action to disrupt the conspiracy. Maria's military training had prepared her for situations where normal command structures couldn't be trusted and individual. Initiative was the only way to prevent catastrophic losses. The knowledge that Master Sergeant Rodriguez had taught her about target prioritization and operational disruption became critically relevant as Maria analyzed the conspiracy's organizational structure. The elimination of key figures could create enough chaos to delay or prevent the planned attacks, but it would require precise targeting and perfect timing. She couldn't afford to miss or to allow any of the conspirators to escape and reorganize their operations. Morrison was the operational coordinator who managed day-to-day activities and maintained contact with foreign buyers. His death would disrupt communications between American suppliers and overseas customers, potentially preventing weapons deliveries that were already in progress. But he was also the most heavily protected target, with bodyguards and security systems that would make him difficult to eliminate without creating obvious evidence of assassination. Park controlled the financial networks that facilitated illegal arms sales, including the offshore accounts and shell companies that laundered money from weapons transactions. His elimination would freeze assets and disrupt payment systems, but the financial structures he had created might continue functioning automatically for weeks or months. Killing him would send a message but might not prevent immediate weapons shipments that had already been funded. Hayes possessed the military intelligence that made precision targeting possible, including access to operational plans and personnel information that enabled the conspiracy to maximize American casualties. Her death would blind the operation's strategic planning, but she had already provided most of the information needed for the immediate attacks. Eliminating her would prevent future intelligence breaches, but might not stop the current crisis. Chun provided the political protection that allowed illegal operations to continue without government interference. His death would trigger congressional investigations and media attention that could expose the entire conspiracy, but it would also alert other participants to the existence of a threat. Killing a senator would bring overwhelming law enforcement attention that could interfere with efforts to eliminate the remaining conspirators. Kozlov represented the international connections that enabled weapons trafficking and provided operational support for insurgent groups. His elimination would disrupt foreign partnerships and potentially prevent weapons deliveries, but he operated through networks that could continue functioning under different leadership. He was also the most dangerous target, with connections to organized crime and intelligence services that would aggressively investigate his death. Maria's analysis revealed that the conspiracy's strength lay in its redundancy and compartmentalization. Each participant could continue operating independently if the others were eliminated, and the weapons already in the pipeline would continue flowing to insurgent groups, regardless of what happened to individual conspirators. Stopping the immediate crisis would require more than assassination. It would demand a coordinated operation that could disrupt multiple aspects of the conspiracy simultaneously. The window for effective action was closing rapidly as weapons shipments moved closer to their destinations and insurgent groups prepared for coordinated attacks against American forces. Maria's training had taught her that sometimes the most difficult tactical decisions involved choosing between imperfect options when perfect solutions didn't exist. The situation demanded immediate action, even if the results couldn't be guaranteed. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. The old knowledge that had been dismissed as obsolete was about to face its ultimate test against enemies who had forgotten that the most dangerous threats often came from directions they weren't watching. The decision crystallized in Maria's mind at 3:47 a.m. on Wednesday morning as she stood in Morrison's office, staring at a satellite photograph spread across his desk. The image showed an American forward operating base in a region where Meridian had delivered anti-tank missiles just 2 weeks earlier. Red circles marked on the photograph indicated optimal firing positions for attacking the base's fuel depot and ammunition storage areas. Someone had calculated exactly how to cause maximum casualties among the soldiers stationed there. Maria recognized the base from her own deployment records. Fox Company, 2nd Battalion had been rotated there just last month. Young soldiers, many on their first overseas assignment, trusting their equipment and their training to keep them alive. The photograph on Morrison's desk was essentially their death warrant, signed by executives who would never see the faces of the people they were condemning. The modified mop stood in the corner of the supply closet, where Maria had left it during her rounds. 3 months of careful engineering had created a weapon that could deliver justice with surgical precision, but using it would cross a line that could never be uncrossed. Once she pulled that trigger, Maria Santos would cease to exist as a law-abiding citizen and become something else, entirely a ghost warrior operating outside the system that had failed to protect the people it was supposed to serve. The first target had to be carefully chosen for maximum psychological impact on the remaining conspirators. Morrison's death would send an unmistakable message that their operations had been discovered and that someone possessed both the knowledge and capability to strike back. But it had to appear random enough to avoid triggering massive security responses that would make subsequent operations impossible. Maria's surveillance had revealed that Morrison followed a predictable routine every Wednesday evening. He stayed late to participate in video conferences with overseas contacts, taking advantage of time zone differences to coordinate shipments and payments. The building's security was reduced during these evening hours, with only a skeleton crew of guards monitoring the lower floors while Morrison worked alone in his corner office. The executive elevator that Morrison used required a special key card to access the 47th floor after business hours. Maria had observed him using it dozens of times, noting that he always checked his phone while waiting for the elevator to arrive. The habit created a window of opportunity where his attention would be diverted from his surroundings, allowing someone with the right equipment to act without being immediately detected. The logistics of the operation required careful consideration of escape routes and evidence disposal. Maria's position as a night janitor provided perfect cover for being in the building during unusual hours, but it also meant that her presence would be recorded by security systems. She needed to ensure that her actions appeared consistent with normal cleaning duties while providing plausible explanations for any unusual activity that might be captured on surveillance cameras. The weapon modification process had included provisions for rapid disassembly and camouflage. The rifle components could be separated and concealed within different pieces of cleaning equipment in less than 30 seconds, making it virtually impossible for investigators to reconstruct the weapon without extensive forensic analysis. The ammunition was untraceable, purchased through private sales that left no paper trail connecting it to Maria's identity. Maria's military training had emphasized the importance of psychological preparation for eliminating human targets. The techniques she had learned for compartmentalizing emotions and focusing on tactical objectives were designed to prevent hesitation during critical moments when split-second decisions could determine mission success or failure. Morrison wasn't a person with hopes and dreams. He was a threat to American soldiers that needed to be neutralized. The approach to Morrison's office required navigating several security checkpoints without appearing suspicious. Maria's normal cleaning routine provided legitimate reasons for accessing restricted areas, but she needed to ensure that her timing coincided with gaps in security patrols. The guards followed predictable patterns that she had memorized over months of observation, creating windows of opportunity when certain corridors would be unmonitored. The technical aspects of the shot required calculations that took into account the building's ventilation systems and structural acoustics. The rifle would need to be fired from a position that minimized sound transmission while ensuring that the bullet's trajectory wouldn't be deflected by air currents or architectural features. Maria had identified the optimal firing position weeks earlier during her routine cleaning activities, testing sight lines and measuring distances without attracting attention. The psychological impact on Morrison's security detail had to be considered as part of the operational planning. His bodyguard was a former police officer who relied heavily on electronic surveillance equipment and metal detectors, but he had no training in recognizing weapons that had been disguised as everyday objects. The guard's response to an unexpected attack would likely involve calling for backup and securing the crime scene, creating chaos that could facilitate Maria's escape. The timing of the operation was critical for preventing immediate retaliation against American forces overseas. Morrison's death needed to occur before he could transmit final authorization codes for weapons deliveries that were already in progress. Maria had identified the specific time windows when his communication with foreign contacts would create maximum disruption to ongoing operations if suddenly interrupted. The first shot would need to be instantly fatal to prevent Morrison from activating emergency communication systems or alerting security personnel. Maria's training had included extensive instruction in human anatomy and the precise placement of bullets to ensure immediate incapacitation. The target acquisition process required identifying specific anatomical landmarks that would guarantee quick death while minimizing the risk of the target surviving long enough to raise an alarm. The weapon's sound suppression system had been carefully engineered to reduce muzzle flash and acoustic signature without compromising bullet velocity or accuracy. The modifications used materials and techniques that Maria had learned during special operations training, where stealth was often more important than firepower. The shot would be audible, but not immediately recognizable as gunfire, potentially providing several minutes before anyone realized what had happened. The escape plan relied on Maria's intimate knowledge of the building's layout and security systems. She had identified multiple routes that would allow her to move from Morrison's office to the service areas without passing through monitored corridors. The timing would need to coincide with scheduled maintenance activities that would provide cover for unusual movement patterns on security recordings. The evidence disposal process required eliminating any traces that could connect the assassination to Maria's identity or reveal the existence of the concealed weapon system. The rifle components would need to be cleaned and separated immediately after use, with different parts hidden in various locations throughout the building. The complete weapon could never be reassembled in the same place, making it virtually Impossible for investigators to prove that it had ever existed. The psychological preparation for taking human life in a civilian context was fundamentally different from combat situations where enemy soldiers posed immediate threats to American forces. Morrison was an unarmed civilian in his own office, protected by constitutional rights and legal procedures that Maria was about to violate. But he was also a traitor whose actions would kill American soldiers if allowed to continue. Maria's reflection on Master Sergeant Rodriguez's teachings revealed that he had anticipated situations where soldiers might need to operate outside official channels to protect their comrades. The techniques he had taught weren't just about eliminating enemy combatants on foreign battlefields. They were about making difficult decisions when institutional authority couldn't be trusted. Rodriguez had understood that sometimes individual conscience was more important than following orders. The moral justification for the operation rested on the principle that Morrison had forfeited his right to legal protection by actively collaborating with enemy forces. His weapons sales weren't business transactions. They were acts of treason that provided material support to insurgent groups attacking American soldiers. The evidence Maria had gathered would justify execution under military law if civilian courts were capable of prosecuting the case. The immediate consequences of Morrison's death would ripple through the conspiracy network, creating uncertainty and paranoia among the remaining participants. Park would suspect that their operations had been compromised, potentially causing him to suspend financial transactions. Hayes would worry that her intelligence leaks had been discovered, possibly making her more cautious about sharing classified information. Chun would realize that someone was actively targeting the conspiracy, forcing him to reconsider his level of involvement. The weapon felt different in Maria's hands as she assembled it, for the first time with lethal intent. The familiar weight and balance that had once provided comfort during combat operations now carried the burden of a decision that would define the rest of her life. She was about to become something that her military training had prepared her for, but that civilian society would never understand or forgive. The old knowledge that had been dismissed as obsolete was about to prove its relevance in the most direct way possible. Morrison would die because he had forgotten that some people still remembered how to wage war the way it had been fought for centuries, quietly, precisely, and without mercy for those who betrayed their own people. The shot was fired at exactly 9:43 p.m. from a distance of 67 meters through the gap between two filing cabinets in the records storage room adjacent to Morrison's office. Maria had positioned herself using the same principles of concealment and stability that had made her one of the Army's most effective long-range marksmen, bracing the disguised rifle against a metal shelf to eliminate any tremor that might affect accuracy. The bullet traveled through the thin drywall partition and struck Morrison in the back of the head as he leaned forward to read coordinates from the satellite photograph that would have guided attacks on American soldiers. The impact was instantaneous and silent from Morrison's perspective. He simply ceased to exist between one heartbeat and the next, his body slumping forward onto the desk while his phone continued to broadcast the voice of a Ukrainian arms dealer discussing delivery schedules for anti-aircraft missiles. The conversation continued for nearly 2 minutes before the caller realized that no one was responding to his questions about payment, authorization codes. Maria had disassembled the weapon and returned the components to their concealed positions within her cleaning equipment before Morrison's bodyguard noticed that something was wrong. The cotton mop head had been reattached to the handle, transforming the precision rifle back into an innocent janitorial tool. The spent shell casing had been collected and sealed in a plastic bag that would be disposed of in an industrial furnace at her apartment building's heating plant. The discovery of Morrison's body triggered a cascade of confused radio calls between security personnel who had never encountered a situation like this. The bodyguard found his employer face down on the desk with what appeared to be a medical emergency, possibly a heart attack or stroke. It took nearly 10 minutes for someone to notice the small hole in the back of Morrison's skull and realize that he had been shot. By that time, Maria was 3 floors away, methodically emptying trash cans while listening to the chaos unfolding through her monitoring equipment. The initial police response focused on external threats and obvious suspects. Detectives assumed that Morrison had been killed by a sniper, positioned in one of the surrounding buildings, possibly a professional assassin hired by business rivals or foreign intelligence services. They sealed off the area around Meridian Tower and began searching nearby rooftops for evidence of shooting. Positions. The possibility that the shot had been fired from within the building itself wasn't seriously considered until forensic analysis revealed the bullet's trajectory. Captain Hassan would have recognized the significance of what had happened, but there was no Hassan in the civilian context, no experienced military officer who understood that the most dangerous enemies often operated from unexpected directions. The investigating officers were trained to look for conventional threats, disgruntled employees with obvious grievances, business competitors with clear motives, or foreign agents with sophisticated equipment. They couldn't conceive of a cleaning lady with advanced military training and a weapon disguised as a mop. The immediate impact on the conspiracy network exceeded Maria's most optimistic projections. Park received word of Morrison's death while he was authorizing wire transfers for weapons purchases, and he immediately suspended all financial transactions pending a security review. Hayes learned about the assassination during a Pentagon briefing and excused herself to make urgent phone calls to contacts who might have information about potential threats to the operation. Chun was informed by his chief of staff while attending a fundraising dinner, and he spent the rest of the evening making discreet inquiries about the investigation's progress. Within 6 hours of Morrison's death, the entire arms trafficking network had ground to a halt as each participant tried to assess their personal risk and determine whether their activities had been compromised. The psychological impact was exactly what Maria had intended, not panic, but the kind of careful paranoia that would make the conspirators hesitant to continue their operations without extensive security reviews. The most immediate benefit was the disruption of weapons shipments that were already in progress. Without Morrison's authorization codes, several cargo planes carrying military equipment were stranded at intermediate stops while their pilots waited for updated instructions. Park's financial freeze prevented payment transfers that would have released weapons from secure storage facilities. The carefully coordinated timeline for arming insurgent groups before American military operations began was falling apart due to administrative confusion rather than external interference. But Maria understood that Morrison's death was only the first step in a process that would need to be completed quickly before the remaining conspirators could reorganize their operations. The confusion and fear that currently paralyzed the network would dissipate within days as the survivors implemented new security measures and communication protocols. She had perhaps a week to eliminate the other key figures before they adapted to the new threat environment. The investigation's focus on external assassins provided perfect cover for Maria to continue her intelligence-gathering activities while preparing for subsequent operations. Detectives interviewed every employee in the building, but their questions focused on suspicious outsiders and unusual visitors rather than the possibility that one of Meridian's own staff members might be responsible. Maria answered their inquiries with the same polite cooperation she showed to everyone, expressing appropriate shock and concern about the tragedy that had befallen her employer. The heightened security measures that followed Morrison's death actually made Maria's job easier in some respects. Additional guards and surveillance equipment were focused on preventing external threats, while internal movements became less monitored as security personnel concentrated on perimeter defense. The assumption that the killer was an outsider who had already escaped created opportunities for someone with legitimate access to move through restricted areas without attracting attention. Park's reaction to Morrison's death revealed the extent to which the financial networks depended on personal relationships and trust rather than institutional safeguards. He began transferring funds from accounts that Morrison had controlled, apparently concerned that law enforcement might freeze assets associated with the murdered executive. The financial movements created electronic trails that Maria could monitor. Using access codes she had obtained from Morrison's computer files, Hayes demonstrated a different type of vulnerability as she reached out to military contacts for information about potential threats to the conspiracy. Her phone calls and meetings created new opportunities for surveillance, while revealing the full scope of her intelligence network. Maria realized that the general was actually more dangerous than Morrison had been, because her Pentagon connections gave her access to resources that could be used to identify and eliminate threats to the operation. The media coverage of Morrison's assassination focused on his public role as a defense contractor rather than his illegal activities, creating a narrative that portrayed him as a patriotic businessman who had been murdered by foreign enemies. The coverage inadvertently provided propaganda support for the remaining conspirators, who could point to Morrison's death as evidence that their security concerns were justified, and their operations were under attack by hostile forces. Chun's response was the most sophisticated, as he used his position on the Senate Armed Services Committee to influence the investigation's direction. Within 48 hours of Morrison's death, the FBI had received instructions to treat the case as a potential act of terrorism requiring coordination with national security agencies. The senator was successfully muddying the investigative waters while positioning himself to monitor law enforcement progress through official channels. Kozlov's reaction was the most concerning from Maria's perspective. The Russian arms dealer disappeared completely after learning about Morrison's death, apparently activating contingency plans that had been prepared for exactly this type of emergency. His contacts with American conspirators ceased abruptly, suggesting that he either considered the operation too compromised to continue or was preparing to eliminate potential witnesses who might implicate him in illegal activities. The technical analysis of Morrison's assassination revealed details that would have impressed Master Sergeant Rodriguez, though the forensic investigators couldn't fully appreciate the skill involved. The shot placement was textbook perfect. The weapon's sound signature indicated professional-grade suppression equipment, and the shooter's escape had been executed with military precision. But the investigators assumed these capabilities indicated a foreign intelligence operation rather than the work of someone with American military training. Maria's observation of the investigation's progress confirmed that law enforcement agencies were fundamentally unprepared to recognize threats from veterans who had been trained in unconventional warfare techniques. The possibility that a former military sniper might be working as a janitor while conducting assassination operations simply didn't appear in their threat assessment models. They were looking for enemies who fit conventional patterns rather than Americans who had learned unconventional skills. The conspiracy's organizational structure, which had been designed to survive the loss of individual participants, was beginning to show strain as the survivors struggled to maintain operational security without Morrison's coordination. The personal relationships and informal communication channels that had made the network effective also made it vulnerable to the kind of targeted disruption that Maria was conducting. Trust was eroding as each participant wondered whether they might be the next target. The window for completing the operation was narrowing as increased security measures and investigative attention made subsequent assassinations more difficult. But Maria had achieved the primary objective of disrupting the immediate threat to American forces overseas. The weapons shipments that would have enabled coordinated attacks on Fox Company and other units had been delayed or canceled entirely, buying time for military commanders to adjust their operational plans. The old knowledge that had guided Maria's actions was proving its continued relevance in ways that modern security experts couldn't comprehend. The assumption that sophisticated threats required sophisticated responses had blinded the investigators to the possibility that simple, direct action could neutralize complex conspiracies more effectively than elaborate counterintelligence operations. Aftermath of Morrison's assassination created an unexpected opportunity for Maria to expand her understanding of the conspiracy's true scope. With the executive's death dominating headlines and triggering security reviews throughout the defense contracting industry, other participants began reaching out to establish new communication channels and coordination methods. What they didn't realize was that Maria had gained access to Morrison's encrypted email accounts and phone systems, allowing her to monitor their desperate attempts to maintain operational continuity. Detective Lieutenant Sarah Chun of the Metropolitan Police had been assigned as the lead investigator on Morrison's murder, and her approach revealed both the strengths and limitations of conventional law enforcement methods. Chun was methodical and intelligent, with 15 years of experience investigating white-collar crime and organized violence. But her training had prepared her to analyze criminal networks that operated according to recognizable patterns, not military-style operations conducted by individuals with specialized knowledge that predated digital surveillance systems. Chun's investigation team had assembled an impressive array of evidence within 72 hours of the murder. They had identified the precise trajectory of the bullet, calculated the shooter's position with mathematical accuracy, and determined that the weapon was a high-powered rifle equipped with professional-grade sound suppression equipment. What they couldn't explain was how the assassin had gained access to a secure building, fired from an interior position without being detected, and escaped without leaving any trace of their presence. The detective's interviews with Meridian employees revealed the careful compartmentalization that had protected the conspiracy for years while inadvertently providing cover for Maria's activities. Most staff members knew nothing about illegal arms sales or unauthorized weapons shipments. They described Morrison as a demanding but patriotic executive who took national security seriously and maintained strict operational security. The few employees who did possess knowledge of questionable activities were too frightened to share information with law enforcement. Maria found herself in the surreal position of being interviewed about a murder she had committed, answering questions from an investigator who was genuinely trying to identify the person sitting across from her. Chun's questions were thorough but focused on external threats and obvious suspects. She asked about suspicious visitors, unusual deliveries, and any conversations Maria might have overheard that could indicate business disputes or foreign interference. "Did you notice anything different about Mr. Morrison's behavior in the weeks before his death?" Chun had asked during their 40-minute interview. Any unusual phone calls, unexpected meetings, signs that he might have been concerned about his safety? Maria had responded with the bland professionalism that made her invisible to most people. "Mr. Morrison always worked late on Wednesdays for his overseas calls. I didn't really pay attention to his business. I just cleaned his office and emptied the trash." The detective had nodded and made notes, clearly viewing Maria as a potential witness rather than a suspect. The psychological impact of maintaining this deception while gathering intelligence about the investigation was unlike anything Maria had experienced during combat operations. In Afghanistan, enemies and allies had been clearly identified, and deception was a tactical tool used against recognizable opponents. Now she was lying to people who were genuinely trying to serve justice, using their dedication against them, while pursuing objectives they couldn't understand. But Chen's investigation was inadvertently providing Maria with valuable intelligence about the conspiracy's reaction to Morrison's death. The detective had obtained warrants for Morrison's financial records, phone logs, and computer files, creating an official record of evidence that Maria could access through her continued presence in the building. Law enforcement's methodical approach was mapping the same criminal network that Maria had been investigating, but from a different perspective and with different objectives. The FBI's involvement in the case introduced complications that both helped and hindered Maria's operations. Special Agent David Park, no relation to Meridian's CFO, brought counterintelligence expertise and resources that local police lacked. His team had experience with foreign intelligence operations and sophisticated assassination techniques. But they also brought assumptions about how such operations were conducted that blinded them to the possibility of domestic threats using unconventional methods. Agent Park's briefings to Detective Chun revealed the Bureau's working theory about Morrison's murder. They believed the assassination was conducted by a foreign intelligence service, possibly Russian or Chinese operatives seeking to disrupt American defense capabilities. The professional quality of the operation suggested extensive planning and specialized equipment that pointed to state-sponsored terrorism rather than domestic criminal activity. The shot placement indicates military-grade marksmanship training. Park had explained during one briefing that Maria overheard while cleaning adjacent offices. The weapon suppression technology is consistent with intelligence service equipment. The escape was executed with precision that suggests extensive operational planning. We're dealing with professionals who have significant resources and institutional support. The investigation's focus on foreign threats created a blind spot that Maria could exploit while gathering intelligence about the conspiracy's attempts to reorganize. Park's financial records were being scrutinized by federal investigators who were looking for evidence of foreign interference rather than domestic corruption. Hayes was being interviewed about potential security breaches that might have exposed classified information to hostile intelligence services. Chun was being questioned about his contacts with foreign officials and potential threats to his safety, but the increased scrutiny was also forcing the remaining conspirators to accelerate their timeline for critical operations. Park had begun transferring funds from accounts that might be frozen by federal investigators, creating new opportunities for Maria to track financial networks and identify previously unknown participants. Hayes was reaching out to Pentagon contacts to gather intelligence about the investigation's progress, revealing the full extent of her network within the military establishment. Most significantly, Kozlov had resumed contact with his American partners through new communication channels that demonstrated the conspiracy's adaptability and resources. The Russian arms dealer was coordinating emergency weapons shipments to insurgent groups that were preparing for imminent attacks on American forces. Morrison's death had disrupted the original timeline, but it hadn't eliminated the threat to soldiers who were depending on their equipment and training to keep them alive. Maria's analysis of intercepted communications revealed that the conspiracy was implementing contingency plans that had been prepared for exactly this type of crisis. Alternative coordination methods had been established, backup financial networks were being activated, and emergency procedures were being used to maintain operational continuity, despite the loss of their primary coordinator. The network was more resilient than she had initially understood. The realization that Morrison's assassination had only temporarily disrupted, rather than permanently disabled the conspiracy forced Maria to reconsider her operational approach. Individual eliminations were having tactical impact but weren't achieving the strategic objective of preventing attacks on American forces. The remaining participants were adapting to the new threat environment faster than she could eliminate them, and their resources exceeded what any individual operator could counter through conventional means. The knowledge that Master Sergeant Rodriguez had imparted about asymmetric warfare became relevant in ways that neither instructor nor student had anticipated. Military doctrine emphasized that smaller forces could defeat larger opponents by targeting critical vulnerabilities and exploiting systematic weaknesses. But the principles Rodriguez had taught were designed for conventional combat scenarios, not for situations where the enemy controlled the investigative apparatus and could manipulate official responses to their advantage. Maria's position as an invisible Janitor, who had committed an undetected murder, gave her unique advantages that no conventional intelligence operation could replicate. She could monitor the investigation's progress, track the conspiracy's adaptation efforts, and plan subsequent operations while appearing to be completely uninvolved in the events unfolding around her. But these advantages would be temporary, lasting only until the investigation's scope expanded or the remaining conspirators identified her as a threat. The decision to continue the elimination campaign required accepting risks that increased exponentially with each operation. Every subsequent assassination would be more difficult as security measures tightened and investigative attention intensified. The psychological pressure of maintaining her cover while planning multiple murders was approaching the limits of what even military-trained personnel could sustain indefinitely. But the intelligence Maria had gathered about imminent attacks on American forces left no alternative except continued action. Park's financial records showed payments for weapons shipments that were already en route to insurgent groups. Hayes's communications indicated that classified operational plans were being shared with hostile forces. Chun's legislative activities were creating new loopholes that would allow even more sophisticated weapons to reach unauthorized users. The conspiracy had demonstrated its ability to adapt to external pressure and continue operating despite increased scrutiny. The only way to prevent the planned attacks on American soldiers was to eliminate enough key participants to cause complete organizational collapse. Morrison's death had been the opening move in a campaign that would need to be completed quickly and decisively before the remaining conspirators could implement defensive measures that would make them untouchable. Detective Chun's investigation was proceeding methodically, but hadn't identified any leads that would result in arrests or charges against the remaining conspirators. Agent Park's counterintelligence operation was focused on foreign threats that didn't exist while ignoring domestic corruption that was actively killing American soldiers. The legal system was demonstrating its complete inadequacy for addressing treason that operated at the highest levels of government and business. The old knowledge that had guided Maria's first successful operation would need to be applied more broadly and systematically to achieve results that conventional law enforcement couldn't deliver. The techniques Rodriguez had taught were about to be tested against enemies who were more dangerous and better protected than any Taliban commander Maria had eliminated in Afghanistan. The transformation in how people perceived Maria began subtly, appearing first in Detective Chun's revised interview notes and Agent Park's updated threat assessments. 3 weeks after Morrison's assassination, Chun had begun requesting additional conversations with building staff who had access to secure areas during overnight hours. Her questions were becoming more specific, focused on individuals who possessed technical knowledge or military experience that might be relevant to the investigation. Maria's personnel file, which had previously been overlooked as routine background information, was now being scrutinized for details that might indicate capabilities beyond those required for custodial work. Her Army service record, redacted though it was in civilian databases, showed deployment to Afghanistan and training in specialized military occupational specialties that Chun's research revealed were associated with combat operations rather than support roles. The shift in investigative focus wasn't dramatic enough to trigger immediate suspicion, but Maria recognized the signs that her invisibility was beginning to erode. Chun had started making informal visits to the 47th floor during evening hours, ostensibly to examine the crime scene, but actually to observe the building's nighttime operations and personnel. The detective was methodical and patient, building a comprehensive understanding of how the building functioned after business hours. Agent Park's counterintelligence team had expanded their investigation beyond foreign threats to include domestic security risks, acknowledging that Morrison's assassination might have been conducted by someone with access to classified information about Meridian's operations. The FBI was beginning to consider the possibility that the killer possessed inside knowledge of the company's activities, though they still assumed this indicated a disgruntled employee or compromised contractor rather than an active military veteran conducting targeted eliminations. The remaining conspirators were adapting to the new security environment with sophisticated countermeasures that reflected their access to intelligence resources and law enforcement contacts. Park had hired a private security firm staffed by former CIA operatives to conduct comprehensive background investigations of anyone with access to sensitive areas of Meridian's operations. Hayes was using her Pentagon connections to gather information about the FBI's investigation and potential threats to operational security. Senator Chen was leveraging his position on congressional oversight committees to influence the investigation's direction while gathering intelligence about law enforcement activities that might threaten the conspiracy. His staff was monitoring federal databases for any unusual queries related to arms trafficking investigations or requests for classified information about defense contractors. The senator was essentially running a counterintelligence operation against the agencies that were supposed to be investigating his criminal activities. Kozlov had implemented new operational security measures that demonstrated the sophistication of his intelligence network. The Russian arms dealer was coordinating activities through encrypted communication channels that use servers in multiple countries, making interception and analysis extremely difficult for American law enforcement. His contacts with the remaining American conspirators were now conducted through intermediaries who had no knowledge of the larger operation, but the increased security measures were also creating new vulnerabilities that Maria could exploit. The private investigators hired by Park were focusing on obvious threats and conventional suspects, using background check procedures that wouldn't reveal the full extent of military training records that remained classified years after a veteran's discharge. Their assumptions about typical criminal behavior blinded them to the possibility that someone might be conducting a systematic elimination campaign using techniques that weren't taught in civilian law enforcement or corporate security training. Hayes's intelligence gathering activities were creating electronic trails that could be monitored by someone with access to the communication system she was using. Her phone calls to Pentagon contacts were being routed through Meridian's corporate telecommunications network, where Maria had installed monitoring equipment during her routine maintenance activities. The general's efforts to gather information about threats to her security were inadvertently providing Maria with intelligence about investigative progress and countermeasures being implemented by law enforcement. Chun's legislative activities were generating official records that revealed the full scope of his involvement in facilitating illegal arms sales. His staff's database queries were creating audit trails that could be accessed by someone with appropriate technical knowledge and physical access to government computer systems. The senator's attempts to monitor federal investigations were providing Maria with real-time information about the agency's capabilities and limitations. The psychological pressure of being investigated while continuing to plan additional operations was testing Maria's ability to maintain operational security under increasingly difficult circumstances. Every conversation with Detective Chun required careful management of verbal and nonverbal responses that wouldn't trigger suspicion. Every interaction with building security personnel needed to appear consistent with normal work routines while concealing preparations for subsequent eliminations. Maria's military training in counter-interrogation techniques proved invaluable during these encounters. She had been taught to control physiological responses that might indicate deception, to provide truthful but incomplete information that satisfied questioners without revealing operational details, and to maintain consistent behavioral patterns that wouldn't suggest hidden knowledge or alternative agendas. The skills that had once protected classified information during potential capture by enemy forces were now being used to deceive American law enforcement officers. the technical challenges of conducting additional assassinations increased. Security scrutiny required innovations that went beyond the equipment and methods Maria had used to eliminate Morrison. The building's surveillance systems had been upgraded with more sophisticated motion detection and facial recognition capabilities. Additional security guards had been assigned to patrol routes that covered areas previously left unmonitored during nighttime hours. The electronic access control systems had been reprogrammed to create more detailed audit trails of who entered which areas at what times, but the security improvements were based on assumptions about conventional threats that didn't account for someone who possessed legitimate access and had spent months studying the building's systems and personnel patterns. Maria's position as a trusted employee with established routines provided cover for activities that would have triggered immediate investigation if conducted by outsiders or obvious suspects. Her knowledge of the building's infrastructure allowed her to identify vulnerabilities that weren't apparent to security consultants who focused on preventing unauthorized access rather than misuse of authorized privileges. The weapons cache that Maria had accumulated in various locations throughout the building represented months of careful preparation that couldn't be replicated quickly as security measures tightened. Individual rifle components were concealed in cleaning equipment, maintenance areas, and storage rooms where they appeared to be legitimate building supplies or janitorial tools. The complete weapons could be assembled in minutes using materials that were already positioned for easy access during routine work activities. The targeting priorities for subsequent operations required careful analysis of how each elimination would affect the conspiracy's ability to continue operations while minimizing the risk of exposing Maria's involvement. Park's death would disrupt financial networks and create chaos in the money laundering systems that facilitated weapons purchases. But his private security team was more sophisticated than Morrison's bodyguard, with electronic surveillance capabilities and threat assessment procedures that would make assassination significantly more difficult. Hayes represented the most dangerous long-term threat because her access to classified military information could enable attacks on American forces even if the arms trafficking network was completely dismantled. Her elimination would blind the conspiracy's strategic planning capabilities and prevent future intelligence leaks that could compromise military operations. But targeting a retired general with Pentagon connections would trigger intensive federal investigations that could expose the entire elimination campaign. Chun's position as a sitting United States Senator made him the most challenging target from both operational and political perspectives. His assassination would create a national security crisis and guarantee massive law enforcement attention that would make subsequent operations impossible. But his legislative activities were actively facilitating attacks on American soldiers, and his intelligence network was helping other conspirators evade detection and continue their criminal activities. The decision-making process that Maria faced required balancing immediate tactical considerations against long-term strategic objectives, while operating under time pressure that increased daily. Intelligence intercepts indicated that weapons shipments were continuing despite Morrison's death, suggesting that American forces would face enhanced threats within weeks, regardless of what action she took against the remaining conspirators. Knowledge that Master Sergeant Rodriguez had imparted about operational planning under pressure was being tested in ways that military training scenarios had never anticipated. Rodriguez had taught his students to prioritize targets based on their strategic value and the likelihood of successful elimination, but he had assumed that operations would be conducted in combat environments where the rules of engagement were clearly defined and institutional support was available. Maria was operating in a legal and moral gray area where every action carried personal consequences that could destroy her life while serving objectives that conventional authority structures couldn't or wouldn't pursue. The techniques Rodriguez had taught were designed for military operations with clear chains of command and defined mission parameters. Adapting those methods to civilian environments required improvisation and risk assessment that went beyond anything covered in official training curricula. The realization that she was becoming visible to investigators forced Maria to accelerate her timeline for completing the elimination campaign. Each day of delay increased the probability that Detective Chun or Agent Park would identify her as a suspect worthy of intensive investigation. But rushing subsequent operations would increase the likelihood of mistakes that could expose her involvement or result in operational failure. The conspiracy was demonstrating remarkable resilience in adapting to the new threat environment, implementing countermeasures and alternative procedures that maintained operational continuity despite Morrison's death. The remaining participants were more cautious, but no less committed to their criminal activities, suggesting that partial success in disrupting their operations wouldn't prevent attacks on American forces. Maria Santos was no longer the invisible janitor who could operate without attracting attention. She was becoming a person of interest in a federal investigation, a potential suspect whose background and capabilities were being scrutinized by professionals who specialized in identifying threats that others missed. The old knowledge was about to face its most difficult test against enemies who were beginning to understand that they were at war. 2 years after that first shot changed everything, Maria stood before a joint congressional committee investigating the systematic corruption that had nearly destroyed American military effectiveness in 3 theaters of operation. The hearing room was packed with reporters, military families, and defense industry representatives who had come to witness testimony that would rewrite how the nation understood threats to national security. Maria wore her dress blue uniform. For the first time since her retirement, the ribbons on her chest, telling a story that few people in the room could fully comprehend. The transformation from invisible janitor to congressional witness had been neither quick nor simple. After eliminating Morrison, Park, and Hayes in a carefully orchestrated campaign that law enforcement never connected to a single perpetrator, Maria had spent 18 months providing evidence to investigators who initially refused to believe that such massive corruption was possible. The documentation she had gathered while working as a custodian became the foundation for prosecutions that sent dozens of government officials and defense contractors to federal prison. Senator Chun had been the final target, eliminated not by assassination but by the systematic exposure of his legislative corruption through leaked documents that destroyed his political career and triggered criminal investigations across 3 congressional committees. Kozlov had disappeared into the Russian intelligence apparatus, but his American network had been completely dismantled through coordinated law enforcement operations guided by intelligence that Maria had provided through carefully managed channels. Congressman Michael Torres, the committee chairman, leaned forward as Maria concluded her prepared statement about the operational techniques she had developed for gathering intelligence while working undercover at Meridian Defense Systems. The congressman was a former Marine officer who understood military capability in ways that civilian politicians often missed, and his questions reflected genuine comprehension of what Maria had accomplished. "Commander Santos," Torres said, using the rank that Maria had been promoted to following her congressional testimony about intelligence operations that had prevented attacks on American forces. "Your methods were unconventional by any standard. Can you explain to this committee why you chose to operate outside official channels, rather than working through established whistleblower procedures?" Maria's response had been carefully prepared. Through consultations with military lawyers and congressional staff members who understood the legal complexities of her situation. "Congressman, the corruption extended to oversight agencies that were supposed to prevent exactly these kinds of activities. Senator Chun was using his position on the Armed Services Committee to facilitate arms trafficking while blocking investigations that might have exposed the conspiracy. General Hayes was providing classified information to foreign arms dealers while serving on Pentagon advisory boards. Traditional whistleblower protections were meaningless when the people responsible for enforcing them were participants in the criminal enterprise. The committee's ranking minority member, Congresswoman Sarah Kim, had spent weeks reviewing classified documents that detailed the scope of the conspiracy Maria had uncovered. Her questions focused on the institutional failures that had allowed such massive corruption to operate without detection for years. Commander Santos, your investigation revealed that American weapons were being deliberately provided to insurgent groups that were attacking our own forces. How many American casualties could be attributed to weapons sold through these illegal networks? The answer to that question remained classified, but Maria's public response conveyed the essential truth without revealing specific operational details. Congresswoman, the weapons that were sold through these networks were specifically chosen to exploit vulnerabilities in American tactics and equipment. The insurgent groups receiving them were provided with targeting information and operational intelligence that came from Pentagon sources. Every American casualty in those theaters of operation was potentially attributable to this conspiracy. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, the committee's chief counsel, had spent months developing legal frameworks for addressing the novel issues raised by Maria's case. The intersection of military justice, civilian law enforcement, and national security created precedential questions that would influence how similar situations were handled in the future. Commander Santos, you conducted what amounted to a covert operation against American citizens on domestic soil. How do you justify those actions under existing legal authorities? Maria's answer reflected months of consultation with constitutional scholars and military legal experts who had grappled with the implications of her case. Dr. Walsh, I operated under the principle that American soldiers have the right to be protected from their own government when that government has been compromised by foreign interests. The people I eliminated had forfeited their constitutional protections by actively collaborating with enemy forces. Military law recognizes the right of individual soldiers to take action when their chain of command has been compromised by hostile intelligence services. The hearing room buzzed with quiet conversations as spectators processed the implications of Maria's testimony. Military families who had lost sons and daughters to weapons sold by American companies were learning for the first time that their government had failed to protect soldiers from domestic threats that were potentially more dangerous than foreign enemies. Defense industry representatives were calculating the impact of new oversight measures that would emerge from these revelations. General Patricia Hendricks, the current chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, had been invited to provide military perspective on the institutional changes that had resulted from Maria's investigation. Her testimony revealed how completely the military had misunderstood the nature of modern threats to operational security. This committee should understand that Commander Santos identified vulnerabilities in our intelligence and procurement systems that we didn't know existed. Her methods were unconventional, but they exposed systematic failures that could have compromised military effectiveness for decades. The techniques that Master Sergeant Rodriguez had taught Maria during sniper training had evolved into something that military doctrine had never anticipated. The old knowledge about individual initiative and operational independence had been adapted for use against domestic threats that conventional intelligence agencies couldn't recognize or counter. Maria's success had forced the military to reconsider assumptions about how modern warfare was conducted and where threats to national security might originate. Admiral James Chun, no relation to the disgraced senator, commanded the Navy's intelligence operations and had been tasked with developing new procedures for identifying domestic threats to military personnel. His testimony emphasized how Maria's investigation had revealed gaps in counterintelligence coverage that foreign adversaries were actively exploiting. Commander Santos demonstrated that our enemies were using American defense contractors and government officials to conduct attacks on our forces. We had no systematic methods for detecting these threats because we assumed they couldn't exist. The psychological impact of testifying about actions that had been taken in secret was unlike anything Maria had experienced during her military career. Every question required her to balance truthfulness with operational security while explaining decisions that had been made under extreme pressure to people who had never faced similar circumstances. The weight of being the sole surviving witness to events that had shaped national security policy was both empowering and isolating, but the most significant aspect of the congressional hearing was its recognition that individual knowledge and initiative remained relevant in an age of institutional complexity and technological dependence. Maria's success had demonstrated that sophisticated threats could sometimes be countered most effectively by simple, direct action taken by people who understood principles that predated modern bureaucratic structures. The legislative outcomes of the investigation were already transforming how defense contracts were managed and how military personnel were protected from domestic threats. New oversight mechanisms required multiple independent audits of weapons shipments and end-user verification procedures that made arms trafficking significantly more difficult. Whistleblower protections had been strengthened to ensure that individuals with knowledge of corruption could report it without fear of retaliation. More importantly, military training curricula were being revised to include instruction in recognizing and countering domestic threats to operational security. The assumption that American soldiers only faced foreign enemies had been permanently discredited by evidence that some of the most dangerous threats came from within their own government and defense establishment. The old knowledge that Rodriguez had preserved through his training was being institutionalized in ways that would ensure future generations of military personnel understood the principles of individual responsibility and operational independence that had guided Maria's actions. The techniques that had once been considered obsolete were being recognized as essential skills for operating in environments where institutional authority couldn't be trusted. Maria's testimony concluded with a message that resonated far beyond the confines of congressional oversight. The people who betrayed American soldiers trusted that no one would remember the old ways of thinking and acting. They assumed that individual initiative had been replaced by institutional procedures and that technological superiority had eliminated the need for personal courage and independent judgment. They were wrong. As she left the hearing room, Maria carried with her the knowledge that her actions had changed not just how the military understood threats to national security, but how individual service members understood their responsibility to protect their comrades when the system designed to protect them had been compromised. The invisible janitor had become unforgettable, not through self-promotion or political maneuvering, but through the preservation and application of knowledge that others had dismissed as worthless. The old signals lived on, passed from instructor to student in military schools, where the curriculum now included case studies of how individual action could succeed where institutional responses had failed. Rodriguez's teachings had found new relevance in a world where the most sophisticated threats often required the simplest solutions, and where the most important innovations sometimes came from remembering what had been forgotten rather than inventing something new. Maria Santos had started as the person nobody noticed, working in the background while others made decisions that affected the lives of American soldiers. She had ended as the instructor everyone remembered, the officer who taught the world that sometimes the most important battles were fought not with advanced technology or overwhelming firepower, but with knowledge, courage, and the willingness to act when action was necessary. The legacy of her hidden war was not just the lives saved or the corruption exposed, but the understanding that in an age of digital communication and institutional complexity, the most timeless military virtues, individual initiative, moral courage, and the willingness to sacrifice for one's comrades remained as essential as ever. The invisible warrior had become a visible reminder that some knowledge should never be forgotten. And some responsibilities could never be delegated to others. The epilogue to Maria's story came 5 years later in an unexpected setting. At the National Infantry Museum in Fort Benning, Georgia, a new exhibit opened featuring weapons and equipment that had shaped modern warfare. Among the displays of cutting-edge technology and sophisticated systems sat a simple industrial mop. In a glass case, the placard beside it read, "Sometimes the most effective weapons are the ones nobody sees coming." This cleaning tool concealed a precision rifle system used by a decorated veteran to expose the largest defense contractor corruption scandal in American history. The operation prevented coordinated attacks on U.S. forces and led to congressional reforms that strengthened military oversight. Visitors often paused at this display, puzzled by the juxtaposition of a janitor's mop alongside million-dollar weapon systems. Military personnel understood the deeper message that individual knowledge, courage, and initiative remained more powerful than any technology when used by someone who understood their true purpose. Maria herself visited the exhibit only once. Standing quietly among tourists and military families who had no idea they were looking at a memorial to her hidden war, she smiled at the irony. After years of being invisible, she had finally achieved the perfect camouflage. Her story was on display for everyone to see, but she remained as anonymous as ever. The old knowledge lived on in new forms. Military academies now taught courses on domestic threat recognition. Veterans organizations shared resources about transitioning specialized skills to civilian careers. The techniques that Rodriguez had preserved through his teaching continued to evolve, adapted by each generation for challenges their instructors had never imagined. If this story of hidden heroism and forgotten knowledge inspired you, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and become part of our community, where we uncover the remarkable stories of ordinary people who did extraordinary things. What other invisible heroes do you think walk among us today? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We read every single one. Ring that notification bell so you never miss stories that remind us that sometimes the most important battles are fought by people no one ever sees coming.